Mock implementations of interfaces are typically used to test the viability of those interfaces and also for general purpose testing. In this video, we're going to create a simple interface and then create a mock implementation of this interface and use that in testing and see how this all comes together. I have an empty VS Code Go project here. I'm going to create a new folder called database and create a new file called database.go and set the package to database. And here we can define our database interface. So this is going to be a user client as an interface. And this will typically have a few methods. Before that, I'm going to quickly write a comment saying that user client abstracts the user functions. And now I can define the interface methods. So let's start with create. So create typically creates a user. Now before all of this, let's create a user. So I'm going to create an API package and a file called user.go, and of course set the correct package name. And here I can create a user, and the user can have a field of ID, and we are just going to make sure that this particular field is unique. This is the constraint that we put up on the project. And we can also have something like age, let's say it's an integer, and the name. This can be any fields, but I'm just going to stick to these three for now and write a short comment. Now this can be used in our interface definition. So let's define the create method. I'm going to take in the context as the first argument. We're not going to use this for this course, but we will see that later. And what we do is to pass a user that needs to be created, and VS Code automatically pre-fills the import for me, so that's easy, and I will return an error here in case the user creation fails. Now we can go ahead and create the other methods. So get would get a user, and this will get the user using the ID. As we defined earlier, the user ID should be unique. So again, the first parameter is going to be the context, and we use this ID, which is a string, and this should return either a user or an error. So let's do that here, api.user and an error. So the update function is a combination of get and create. So what we can do here is to change the name to update, and then we can also pass in the update value. So get the user with this ID and then update it. So I'm going to call this as update just to make it clearer, and it only returns an error in case the update fails. And I will also finally just do the delete function. So that deletes a user, and this is quite similar to get in terms of the arguments. The first one would be the context, the second one would be the ID, and there will be an error in case this fails. So I'm going to update the comment here. All right, so that's the basic interface, and we don't use the context now, but we will get to that at some later point. And now what I can do is to create a new user function that returns an implementation of this interface. So since we're in the package database, we will just call it new user, and then it returns this user client. So first we need some arguments. We will come back to that later on. And at the moment it returns nothing because we don't have any implementation yet. So we just say return nil, write a short comment saying new user returns a new user client. And it's based on the type, but the configuration and stuff, we will get to it later on in this video. So we just implement the shell right now, and this all looks good so far. So now let's actually test this database interface. So we create a test file and use the same package. You can also use _test, but I'm not doing that, and define the basic test function. So this is users. And now typically in this test function, we have to instantiate the database client and then use it to access its methods and try to get our users. So what I'm going to do before that is to use some assertions to make testing a bit easier. And for that, let's go to the Golang package repository, package.go.dev, and do a search for assertions. And there are lots of options. As you can see, there are 25 matching modules. And I'm going to scroll down a little bit to find the one that I like. You can use any of these based on your experience. I like the Smarty assertions package, so this is what I'm going to use for this case. And the way to instantiate that is just using a, or we're going to just call assertions as a, and that's the variable. And we're going to say assertions.new. Call that function to instantiate a new assertion, and then we're going to pass the testing variable to it. And as you see, there's an error because of course the package is unknown. And I'm going to expand this import here like this, and then use this import path. And of course it shows that this path doesn't exist. This is actually quite easy to fix. So I'm going to go to my command line, and I'm going to create a mod file first. So we can do that by doing go mod init, that initializes. And then what we can do now is, if you go back and see, you have the mod file with the module name, the Go version, etc. And then we do go mod tidy, and this makes sure to link the correct package. And once this is done, this also creates a go.sum file where everything is set up, and this should be fixed. So now the package is seen. And now what we can typically do is to use these assertions. So first, let's start with creating this client. So we have a method for this. We can use the new user function to create a new client. Of course, right now it's all nil, but we will get to that in a minute. Call it client, and now we can use the methods of this client to work with our users. So what we can do is to create a user. And let's say user is api.user, and let's define some dummy values here. So the ID, which is supposed to be unique, we just call it Alice. Name, let's say also Alice. And let's the age as 25, let's say. It should be an integer, so I will fix that. And so this is your typical user. And now I can use the create method of the client to create this user. So you need the context, which I can just use the background context for now. Again, in this video, we're not going to talk about using the context, but this is generally a good convention to follow. You have a context, and then the user is what we've defined here, so we can pass user. So now this returns an error which we need to handle. So for that, what we can do is to call the SO, or the SO function, from the assertions package. And this is a special function that expects 3 arguments, or 2 arguments and 1 is optional. So it takes 2 values and does some sort of assertion on those values. So that's called the SO function. So as an example, this will make it easier. So on the one side, we're checking that this error should, which is the way that these things are defined, assertions.should. And in this case, because the create function should be successful, we expect that the error should not be nil. So in this case, there's no third argument required. So this error should not be nil. And this is typically the format of how you do assertions using this package. And so is the function you use to run these assertions. And this returns a Boolean, which is true or false, whether the assertion is true or not. And if it returns false, then the test case has failed, and then we can do a failure here. And I'm going to write a comment saying that the assertion failed, and we can do the t.fail or fail now, or whichever you want. I'm going to use fatal f, so I can write a custom comment here, and I can say unexpected error, and then link the error that we received using %v and then error, and that should link the error here. So now let's move on to get the created user. And I'm going to copy this from here. And when you do let me fix this here. So if you do a get, you need to use the ID, and then it returns either the user or an error. So in this case, we can use our ID and use that value. And we can just say got. This is a mistake here. Yeah, of course, because I'm still using the create function. I'm going to change this to get. And got is the user that we received back. And then we need to handle the error and the assertion. So I'm just going to copy this and say, if there's we still expect no error here, so we can copy the same assertion. And if we receive the user, we should just compare that to the user that we created above. So let's say got value should be, we can use the should be equal function, which should be here somewhere, should equal. And then now you have a third argument, which is what is the expectation. So we're expecting that the value that is returned is the same as this user that we created above, because that's what we used to create the user. And we use that ID to get it, and then we compare it. If it's the same, we got what we created. So we can of course go ahead and write other cases, but let's stop here for now. And I'm going to just write a comment saying add test for update, delete, etc. We can get back to this later on, but for now, for the purposes of this video, I think this is sufficient. So let's try to run this test. Of course it will fail, but it's good to just run anyway. So I'm going to pick the location from go source onwards and then run it. We are now at the root of this project, and we need to look at the database package. So it's database, and that should run the test. Yeah, as you can see, there's a panic, obviously, because our interface is nil. There's no implementation for that interface. And if you remember, this new user just returns nil at the moment. So typically in a project, now that you've defined an interface like this, you would define an implementation of that interface. So I would do something like package MySQL, implement a new file called mysql.go, and then write code in there that accesses a MySQL database, for example, and that will satisfy this interface. In this particular project, what I'm going to do, instead of actually doing implementations of the typical databases, I'm going to implement a mock, and we will go ahead and do that now. And what we wanted to do here is to switch based on a type, and we will see what that is right now. So the argument, we were going to switch to a string type. And first of all, let's create a package called mock. A mock is just a mock implementation, which basically means it's a dummy implementation of this database interface. And we typically use this for testing our interfaces before we actually implement different clients. So what I'm going to do in this mock package is to create a mock user database as a structure. Actually, mock.mock user database sounds a bit weird, so I'm just going to call it user database and write a comment that this is just a mock implementation of the user database interface. So this mock database has to now implement these methods in order to satisfy the database interface. So if we go to our file, we can take these methods, and our mock database has to implement these methods. And that is what we are supposed to do now, to make sure that this user database struct implements these methods. So what I'm going to do is just go one by one, and I will take the first method, which is create. And let me close some extra files here. And what I'm going to do is to make this structure implement this by using it as a receiver. So user database now has a method called create. It has the same structure as the create method of the database interface. And what we can also do is just write a comment. So instead of repeating the comments, I typically like to just say this create function implements the interface that it's implementing. And then if you want to know what that actual function does, you can look at the comments on the interface. Let's also just rename this user database to user client, because I think that sounds a little better. You can also call it a mock client, mock user client, all of those are possible. And I'm just going to refactor this to accept that. And I can just return nil. We will come back to the implementation in a bit. So now I'm just going to repeat this process for the get and other methods. So let me make a few copies and let's see what this does. Get has 2 arguments, so I'm just going to copy that structure and just paste it here. And we need to return 2 values, return nil, nil. Now, because the method is expecting an API.user, we can return an empty API.user, but this is a little ugly. So what we can instead do is to just update our interface to return a pointer, and then we can then return nil if the user is not found, for example. And let me update that to a pointer, and that's good. So update would be the next method. Updates a user, it has 3 arguments and returns 1 error. So we can just do something like this and remove the extra things. Okay, and update looks good. Update the comment as well. And the final one is delete. So let me also do delete, and it only requires the ID, and change this to delete, and that looks pretty good, I think. So now what we can do is, if the type that is provided to this function is mock, then we can return this mock implementation. So we switch on the type and we can say case mock. And if it's a mock, then we just return a new instance here. Mock.userClient doesn't really sound good. So what I can actually do here is to, instead of directly using the struct, I can define sort of a constructor. And in order to do that, what I can do here, let me first check what the error is. There seems to be a mismatched type for delete. So somewhere an error is required. Oh, I see. So the interface is wrong. Of course, you need an error in case delete doesn't work. So that's good. And now this works, but this is a bit ugly. So what I can also just do is to create a new function that is a new function, and which returns this user client. And because it's a user, I can just say new user. If the package was called user, then I would just say new. But since this is mock, I can say mock.newUser. And then at the moment, we just return a new user client. And we can replace this with new user. And so now if the user chooses mock, then we choose the mock user. And by default, we can return an error. So I'm going to create a named error here and call it, let's say, error unknown type or unknown client type. Should be better, yeah. And I'm just going to define a new error and say unknown error type. And I can use, that looks good, I think. And I can use this now here and just return this error. But we don't have an error in our definition, so I'm just going to update this to return an error, both these values, so error and a user client. And then in the first case, there's nil error, and in the second case, we can just return a nil. A user client is an interface. No, we don't need to do this. Do I need to? No, I don't actually need to use a pointer here, so this is just nil. And that function looks pretty good. I think we can now go ahead and use this. So what we do typically is to get this type, and based on the type which is configured, you can return a implementation. And for example, in the future, if you implement MySQL, then use the same thing, switch on the type, and then return the implementation of that type. If you create a new package, for example, you have another database called Redis, and then you can return that implementation based on the type that you switch, which you provide to this function. So this is quite extensible. I'm going to remove all of these now, and we can go ahead and, yeah, let me quickly remove this. So now I can use this in my test. And here what I can do, it needs an argument, so I'm just going to say mock, and this returns 2 return values, the client and the error. So we need to handle the error here. And if this error is not nil, then we just need to exit the test, because without the client being set up, we cannot go further. And just say fatal and say error. We don't need to add a message, so I'm just going to keep it like this. And then we're going to use that client to then, oh, there's an extra error here. Just remove that, redefining it, and the rest should be okay. So now if I run it, at least we don't have a panic, but then you see that you're getting the unexpected values. This is because our mock implementation doesn't really have an implementation yet. We just have stubs, so which we have to now go ahead and implement. So what we're going to do to simulate a database is to store this data locally, which means that we're going to, in memory, define a map and store the value in the map. You can also use a slice, but a map is much easier to work with for this case. So this map takes a string, which is the user ID. So the key of the map is the user ID, which is the unique, and then which has to be unique for a map, of course, and then the value would be the api.user. So now what I can do in the create method is to first check if a user with the same ID exists, and if that user exists, we return a special error called user does not exist or user already exists. And in order to check that, what we do is to get this map and see if a value of this key exists. You do it like this. So user, OK is user ID. And if OK, it means that this user exists. So we don't want to create a user that already exists. So we have to return an error to the caller saying that the user already exists. So what I can do typically now is to define another error here. So I can go to the database file instead and just say error user already exists, and say user already exists. So now I can use this error in the mock. So I can just say return database dot error user already exists. So now this actually creates a little bit of an import cycle, because the package database is used in the mock package for the error, whereas package mock is used in the database package to switch the implementation. So we can easily solve this by just moving errors to a dedicated package, at least the specific errors. So here I'm just going to create a new folder called errors, a file called errors.go, and just create a package and then define the package here. This just has to be a variable. I will expand this because I'm going to create more errors in the future. So that is fine. And then just change the name here from the package name rather, from errors to this one, and then we can return that error. So now if the user doesn't exist, that means we can now create it. So what we do is to create the user, and in our case creation is basically just writing to the map. So I'm gonna set the key as the user. Okay, let me change this first to call it client instead of you, because it's a bit confusing. And let me set that here and here. So now what I can do is to use the key user.id, and the value would be the user that we receive from the argument, and then I return a nil. So we've technically created a user, which is basically writing this user into the map at that key. I'm going to write a small comment. That looks good. And now we just have to get this user. This is actually quite easy because we've done this before. From above, what we can do is to just copy this here, actually this whole thing. And what we can do here is to get this user and using the ID, so change this to just the ID. And in this case, now if it's not OK, it means that the user does not exist. We have to return an error saying user does not exist. So let's define a new error here and say error user not found, for example. You can also call it not exists, but user not found is more conventional. Remove the extra space here. Okay, so user not found, and I'm going to return that particular error here. And it needs 2 arguments, so the first one should be nil. So nil error user not found. And I need to use the import, so this is errors with a single error user not found. And if there is no error, then I just return this user, and we need the pointer, so I just use the pointer. And now we have the get implementation, and similarly you can do an update and a delete implementation, which writes and reads data from this map. So what we now have is an interface with 4 methods, and we have a mock implementation for those methods. Okay, so in my test package, we have this create and get that we are using to test. And now because we have an implementation, if we run the test now, you see that there's a new panic. This is not the same as what we saw before because it's a nil entry to a map. I know exactly where the problem is. So if I go into the mock implementation, I can see that this map is not initialized. So that is quite easy. What we can do is to initialize it here using the make function. And you can, of course, create a capacity or the length, but I'm just going to use make of this type and just say string API user. We're just making a map of this particular type. And now if we run, we don't have a panic anymore, but then we have an issue called user not found. This is quite a strange error. Let's see what's happening. So the error is coming from the get function, and it's saying that the user does not exist. There's something weird here, because typically you're writing to a map and just reading from a map, so this should just work. And what we're doing now is, taking the user. So the issue is that we are overwriting the user, so nothing gets written to the map. And now that should work. So we're having a difference of what we expect and what we get. And we're expecting a value, but then we're actually getting a pointer, I think, or the other way around actually. So here's a pointer and we return a pointer. Okay, because user is not a pointer. Okay. So we're comparing a pointer with a non-pointer, so that's where the error is. So you can either dereference the value or just add a pointer here. So I can just do something like this. No, the other one. And now you're comparing two pointers, so that's good. And now as you can see, this test pass. So now we've used this mock interface to mock the database. We've done a few basic implementations. Now I want you to complete this by doing the update and the delete yourself.